We're going to do this one, and then we're going to take a 5-minute break after this one before we start regular council meeting.
Hello, thank you. So like you said, I'm here to talk about trees on private properties. So this is a follow-up to our June 8th council meeting where we talked about the same topic. So at that meeting, U.S. Council provided direction to do a little bit further research on how other cities regulate trees. So I have done that, and I've ran that research past the tree committee, and I've gotten their input and assistance on the research in general, and then I used that research to create the matrix that we will go over that the tree committee also reviewed. So I'm going to share my screen. And I do want it to be noted that this will offer multiple options, and multiple of these options can be pursued at the same time if desired. So the big question for this matrix is, what should we do to encourage tree preservation on private property? So I've outlined 3 options with concerns, advantages, and disadvantages for each. So the first is removing liability. So the concern there is that tree removal is occurring to avoid the liability trees pose in the land use review portion of the development process. So more trees than necessary are removed to avoid regulatory protection of those trees later in the process. So what might be done there is to remove the incentive to preemptively remove trees from a development site prior to beginning the land use review process. An advantage is that little to no additional staff time would be required. Disadvantages include that developers may still see tree preservation as a liability and remove trees anyways, and that tree regulation would not be present at any stage in the development process, meaning there would be no proactive protection of mature native trees, just the passive protection that we currently have. Another option is to add incentives. The concern here is that tree removal is occurring with no penalty. So an advantage of what could be done is to encourage tree preservation by offering incentives to developers. Incentives could include density bonuses, variation in parking requirements, lot size averaging, variation in open space requirements, project publicity, and stormwater SDC credits. Some disadvantages include code changes to include incentives in the development process should be completed on the same timeline as changes to the zoning code and engineering standards. Developers may choose to not use the offered incentives with still no penalty. And incentive levels needed for tree preservation would need to be compared against other city interests, such as availability of developable land. The third option is regulation of all trees. That concern is that tree removal is occurring with no regulation for tree preservation in the development process until the land use review. What could be done is to require tree preservation by regulating tree removal citywide. This would allow us to not need to distinguish between developed and undeveloped properties, and a citywide tree inventory could be created. Disadvantages to this option include city staff time needed to monitor and enforce the citywide regulation program, and a penalty may be needed for failure to comply. Additional costs may be required to develop a citywide tree inventory. So those are our 3 options that I have based on my research. Are there any questions?
Mark?
So can you give us a summary of what the tree committee said?
Sure. So the tree committee off of this matrix was pretty much in agreement that any of these options could be good at some level, depending on the final outcome of each option. So with those advantages and disadvantages and the council input of what exact direction.
So they didn't have a recommended 1 or 2 or whatever?
Nope, the general consensus from them was that any of these options would be beneficial to some degree for the preservation of trees on private property.
I have opinions, but I will wait until after we get past the question part.
Any other questions for Haley? It looks pretty spelled out here. That's great. Tim?
Oh, just briefly, Haley, you said that you had gone to other cities and kind of to help formulate this matrix. Can you give us an idea of what cities you looked at?
Sure, I looked at numerous cities. I looked at Lake Oswego, Portland, Bend, Sammamish, Redmond. I looked at numerous, Troutdale, Wilsonville. Really, I looked at probably 15 different cities of varying sizes to try to get just as much information as I could of how other cities do regulate trees on private property.
So for all those cities then that they did have some form of tree regulation, would that be correct?
Some form of tree regulation or none. So there was some that is similar to kind of the first and second options put together, that they just kind of self-regulate based on incentives and have incentives to the level that developers choose to self-regulate.
So the non-regulation you're referring to is the incentive route.
Mm-hmm. So, and that was, it seemed to be with more larger cities that had that kind of option. I was having a little bit of difficulty throughout my research finding a city that was similar in size to Hood River. Mm-hmm. A lot of cities I found were much larger population bases.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, opinions. So Mark, you have some ideas or some opinions. Go ahead.
So I was afraid that we were going to be asked which of these one rows that we wanted to use, when it seems like all three are complementary, or certainly the top two are complementary. My sense is we need to do something. My sense is also that if we defined for the bottom row, if we defined it as just trees that are 15 inches or, some just large trees, it's not, this says all trees, and that, I think that that's silliness. But if we defined it to be, significant trees, both the survey wouldn't be that bad since we have Google Earth. And we have, and the enforcement wouldn't be that bad. Haley, did you see anything where people just had to apply for a permit to cut something down as opposed to not being allowed to? Is that how it worked in the third case?
Yeah, I did see a lot of cities that had a permit with a permit fee, and the permits were variable in their complexity, from just a single page, fill it out, to having a site assessment and an arborist review before that permit was reviewed and accepted by the city.
All right, so I think we should do some, I guess, just to sum up my point is, I think we should do something. I think we should even see if there's a low impact way to do the third row, but certainly the first two.
So say that again, Mark. Where are you? So just when it comes to these three things.
The first two rows are complementary. They're not in competition.
Okay.
So I think that those are good things to do. I think the third row is also complementary, and that there is a way to do low hurdle implementation of that. I mean, you can, the range of implementation complexity on the third row is really wide. So I am optimistic that we could do something simple. Maybe it's even, if there isn't consensus for that, maybe that's a future step, given that we see how the first two rows go. So.
Okay, others? Megan?
Yeah, I'll go. So yeah, given our current landscape of, the regulation only during the land use process does seem to be creating an incentive for people to just cut everything down ahead of time because they don't know what they're going to do. I think there would be an improvement if we just removed the liability in this first one. Not my highest priority of things we're doing this year, but I'm open to talking about incentives as we talk about incentives for other things. I respectfully disagree with Mark that there is an easy way to do any sort of regulation of all trees in the city or all trees of a certain size in the city. And I'm not particularly interested in that at this point. Going to the thing we kind of have been harping on of like, what's my top 3 things for this year? That is not where I want to put staff time and resources. So that's where I'm at.
Okay, others? Jessica?
I'm more in line with Megan. There's part of me that worries about taking away any kind of protection of the trees during the land use review process, but I recognize that it is causing some of the trees to be removed. So I don't know, I guess I'm not really sure on that one. I do like the idea of using incentives somehow then. So I guess maybe if you do take it away, then using some kind of incentive so that folks would still want to keep their trees. And I don't know, I'm not super excited about regulating protection of all trees. Maybe kind of like what Mark said, maybe that's like, in the future if it's not working out or something. Yeah, and I agreed that on the staff time thing, just is something to keep in mind with everything else that's going on.
Others? I'll go ahead and go. And then Tim after me. I agree with Megan. I'd like to remove the liability because I think that just, cut them down because then we don't have to worry about it prior to doing some development. So I think removing that liability, I'd be all in favor of doing that. But then putting in incentives when we do this other work, that we would just put it in with the other work that we have to do for the code changes that we're talking about, to do some incentives. And maybe some, a really, some really great incentives for trees that are a certain size or bigger. But, that would be all in the details later. I don't want to get into that right now. I'm not into regulating all trees. I just think it's just too much. Even if it's, trees that are 15 inches or bigger, inventorying them, I just think we don't have the time for it right now. So I'm agreeing with Megan's opinion on it. Tim?
Thanks, Mayor. I guess I would have reservations about removing the liability. I'm not exactly sure what that means, to be perfectly honest with you. Haley, could you give us an idea of what removing liability means?
So I might call upon Dustin as well to explain it a little bit better than me. But so in the current process, it appears that developers are removing trees prior to applying to the land use review process, as throughout that process, they have to be responsible for those trees. So they're removing more trees than necessary to avoid the regulations present in the land use review process.
Because when you turn in your land use application or your building permit, you have to put down what trees are on your property right now, how big a diameter they are, how big of the drip line is. And if you want to put a building anywhere close to that, then there's a question about whether, oh, well, maybe you can't put in a, 2,000 square foot home or a 1,000 square foot home. Maybe your home's going to only be 800 square feet or 500 square feet because that tree is going to encroach and the city's going to say, you've got to keep it. So they just cut it down, take it out. Then you can get what you want to build.
So, but how is removing the liability actually going to take care of that problem? Because really, in the end, that's going to happen one way or the other. So, if you have a building plan, and the site plan is such that you can't put a water line somewhere because there's a tree there. I mean, you're going to have to take the tree down one way or the other.
Right.
It might be.
I can tell you how it works. So if we didn't have this regulation, if we got rid of this regulation, builders wouldn't cut down the trees prior to coming in and talking to the city, or they may not. And like it says in here, they may and they may not. But it's less likely that they would just cut them all down, because they could come in and they could work with the city to try and figure out how to do something different. And they might take down 2 trees instead of 3 because, they'd think, oh, I'm not going to be in trouble. They're not going to force me to make my building smaller if I come in and I haven't cut down that tree. But right now, the city might say, oh, no, you have to save that tree. So they're just going to cut it. So I think there's more flexibility and less fear that they're going to get in trouble. So that's what removing liability is about for the builder.
Yeah, thanks for that example, Mayor. It would be great to actually, which cities were doing that, Haley?
So it was kind of a combination. I would have to look back at my notes, but all 3 of these options were from a combination of different cities and different pieces of different cities' regulation protocols.
All right. So you had some cities that removed liability, but then added the incentives. Right.
Correct.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting.
If I could jump in, it's removing the liability is basically not regulating them through the land use process. It is not something active that the city does.
Boy, I would like to see how that's working for the cities personally. But,
So there are cities that just simply don't regulate. More common, Haley, correct me if I'm wrong, in some of the more rural areas, Eastern Oregon.
Correct.
Others, or Tim?
With respect to, I'm all for adding incentives as well. I'm going to maintain just through ignorance, I guess, of the efficacy of removing liability. I'm just going to maintain my uneasiness with that one. With respect to regulating trees, I can understand that regulating all trees is one thing, but what I'm kind of wondering is that if we could, provide some type of regulation about the number of trees that one can take down at a time. And that might actually, we could say, is like, could take down no more than 2 trees that are 15 inches in diameter per year or something like that, without at least having some type of permit or some type of review. That might help reduce at least the original impetus behind this, which was the clear cutting of trees to facilitate development. So I guess that's kind of a mishmash of different things there, but with adequate proof, I guess I could support the removing the liability part of it. And then I think we definitely should add incentives for people to retain the trees. but then would be interested at the least of trying to limit the number of trees that you can take down at any one time.
Gladys, I think everyone has spoken, but Gladys.
Yeah, thank
Go
you,
ahead.
Mayor. You know, I believe we absolutely should be adding incentives. I guess, first of all, let me say that I too don't feel 100% about just being educated about trees and the size and, you know, all of that. As you know, as Councilor Saunders mentioned, to be honest, this is not a priority for me for the year or something that I want to allocate staff time for the next year. I'd rather have everyone working on housing or transportation or many other things. I believe we should add some sort of incentive. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Okay. Do you think you kind of have enough direction, Haley, on kind of where we are?
I think so.
Okay. All right, great.
Yeah, I think we got it. Thank you very much, Mayor,
Okay.
councilors.
Yes.
All right.
thank you.
And just to reiterate, I think what we heard was, you know, let's look at some of those incentives maybe as a first step, and then we can look at the other two kind of along the way and as we go. So that's what we'll bring back, and incentives along with some of the other code updates that we're looking at. So thanks
Okay,
very much.
Not as a separate item, but as we're looking at the other code updates. So it's just kind of
Correct.
consolidated with the other things.